After swallowing the pill that my daughter-in-law Emma fed me, I struggled to breathe. My vision blurred. Brian held me in his arms and sneered. Finally, we're sending him off to see Ethan. Ethan, my son, had died in a car accident just a week ago. Yes, I've waited for this moment for 30 years. He's finally dead. The once gentle and loving Brian now revealed his true, ruthless nature. I spent an entire year switching out the medicine. Even if the police investigate, they won't find anything. So it was him all along. He had been replacing my medication right under my nose. Brian looked at me with disgust, as if I were nothing more than an insect, before turning to Emma with a tender smile. From now on, the three of us can live peacefully together. I refused to accept such a cruel fate. With unwillingness filling my heart, I took my last breath. But when I opened my eyes again, I was back in the hospital delivery room, the moment Emma gave birth. The newborn waved his tiny hands, while Ethan stood beside Emma, smiling as he looked at the baby. The entire family was filled with joy over the new life. Yet, I broke the happiness in the room with a single sentence. Why does this baby look nothing like Ethan? The room fell silent. Ethan's smile stiffened slightly. Brian glanced at Emma from the corner of his eye before quickly responding, "He takes after his mother." Emma immediately chimed in, "Yes, he looks just like me. Look at his eyebrows, his nose, it's exactly the same." She hesitated for a moment before adding, "But his eyes, those look like Ethan's." I sneered inwardly. The baby's eyes weren't even fully open yet, how could she possibly tell? In my previous life, I never noticed the subtle interactions between Brian and Emma. Back then, when my grandson was born, the entire family was overjoyed. Ethan was even more enthusiastic than Emma, taking on every responsibility, changing diapers, preparing formula, personally tending to the baby's every need. Every day after work, he canceled all his plans just to rush home and be with his child. Brian, my husband, treated the baby like a priceless treasure, even more attentively than he had ever treated Ethan. I had always believed this was just grandfatherly love. But the truth was, this baby was his own son. 3 months later, Ethan left for a business trip. His car lost control and plunged off a cliff. His body was never recovered. I was already in poor health, and the overwhelming grief drained the last of my strength. I became so weak that even standing was a struggle. In the very home I had dedicated my life to, I was treated as nothing more than a shadow. Brian and Emma openly flaunted their relationship, completely disregarding me. They even whispered to each other, right in front of me, about how they had tampered with Ethan's car, causing the crash. They controlled me, locked me in the basement, denied me food. I was nothing more than an animal in their eyes. In the end, they took my life with a single pill. Then, the three of them left together, moving to another city, ready to start a new life, free of guilt, free of burden. But in this life, I will never let them succeed. They will pay for what they've done. Ethan, convinced by Emma's words, turned his attention back to the baby, playing with him and laughing. He even reassured me, "Mom, Emma is right, the baby does look more like her. Newborns are wrinkled and red, it's hard to see any resemblance at all." I gave a casual smile. I suppose so." Emma looked exhausted, and Brian, ever the attentive husband, thoughtfully placed a pillow behind her back. Ethan was so focused on the baby that he barely even noticed me. Feeling irritated, I said, "I'll stay here tonight. You two men should go home and rest." Ethan hesitated, concerned about my health. "Mom, you don't need to tire yourself out. I'll take care of Emma. Besides, there are nurses here too. You and Dad have been up all night, go home and get some rest." Emma had gone into labor in the middle of the night and only gave birth at 5 in the morning. None of us had slept much. I insisted that Brian go home. Since Emma was a woman, it made sense for me to stay with her. I agreed to rest. But when both Ethan and Emma had fallen into deep sleep, I got up and approached the newborn's crib. I gently stroked the fine hair on his head before taking out a cotton swab and carefully swiping the inside of his mouth to collect a DNA sample. The baby squirmed uncomfortably and started wailing. Ethan woke up abruptly, his voice filled with confusion. "Mom, what are you doing?" I quickly put away the sample and picked up the baby. He was probably hungry. Ethan didn't suspect anything and handed the baby to Emma so she could feed him. Meanwhile, I discreetly collected DNA samples from both Brian and Ethan, then sent them off for paternity tests. As expected, the baby was Brian's. Just as I finished hiding the test results, Brian, as always, brought in a glass of water and my medication. "Take your medicine," he said. My health had been poor for years, requiring me to take multiple pills every day. Some medications required 3 pills twice a day, while others needed 2 pills 3 times a day. I had never bothered keeping track of them. Brian always prepared them for me. If he was at work, he would leave strict instructions with the housekeeper, and if that wasn't enough, he'd even call to remind me at the exact time. Everyone envied me, saying how lucky I was to have such a devoted, attentive husband. They called it a blessing from my past life. I stared at the pills in the bottle cap for a long time without saying a word. A husband who swapped his wife's medication, murdered her, and even conspired to kill his own son. Yes, what a wonderful blessing I had indeed. Brian noticed my hesitation. "What's wrong?" he asked. His face was tense, his muscles stiff. He was nervous. Was he afraid I had figured something out? I remained calm, took the pills, and washed them down with water. Brian helped me lie down before stepping out to put the glass away. As soon as he left, I spat out the pills I had hidden between my teeth and quickly tossed them under the bed. The next morning, before the housekeeper came to clean, I discreetly disposed of the evidence. Later that day, I took 1 pill from every type of medication I had and, under the pretense of running an errand, went to a lab to get them tested. After that, I headed to the company. The business had originally been a state-owned enterprise, but after privatization, my father, who had been the factory director, partnered with a few colleagues to buy it out. Through several rounds of resource integration, the company had grown into a successful business. I rarely visited, and most employees barely recognized me. The current general manager, someone who had watched me grow up, personally came down to greet me. "Why didn't you call Uncle Brian?" he asked. "Brian worked here as the vice president." I smiled. "I just wanted to look around. I'm a shareholder of this company, after all, but it seems that every major decision is left to Brian. Don't you think it's time I got more involved? I can't rely on him for everything." The general manager was visibly surprised, but also pleased that I was finally taking an interest in the company. He gave me a general overview of the current business operations. Soon after, Brian rushed over, visibly unsettled. "Why are you here? You're not in good health. Overworking yourself will only make it harder to sleep at night." To outsiders, he was the picture of a caring husband. I smiled. I can't stay idle forever like a turtle hiding in its shell. His surprise was obvious. He was afraid I might reclaim my authority. I took a tour of his office and through the large glass walls observed the young female employees working under him. I wondered how many of them had suffered at his hands. Brian's infidelity hadn't started after Emma entered our family. He had been unfaithful countless times before. He preyed on the women in his office, knowing they wouldn't dare speak out against him. This was something he had personally boasted about while tormenting me. Emma had been one of his mistresses all along. Ethan had met her at a company gathering and fallen for her at first sight. Coincidentally, she became pregnant, and Brian saw the perfect opportunity. He let Ethan take responsibility for the child, turning him into an unwitting fool. I had been blind. I had failed to see their affair, failed to protect my son, and ultimately ruined myself in the process. I turned to Brian and said, "I'll be attending the next shareholder meeting personally." For a brief moment, the cracks in his carefully constructed mask began to show. "Why the sudden interest in all this?" "I've been idle for too long. My body and mind are rusting. I need something to keep me active." Brian was about to protest, but I cut him off. "I just feel bad for you and want to help more," I said, keeping my tone light. But Brian's face still darkened with displeasure. After Emma finished her postpartum recovery, I made an appointment for her at a beauty salon. While Brian was busy with his latest project, I slipped out to retrieve the test results. The report confirmed what I had suspected. Each of my prescribed medications was harmless on its own. However, when mixed together, they put a severe strain on my heart, increasing the risk of a sudden cardiac arrest. I handed the original medication list to the technician. "Is there any issue with these prescriptions?" "No, these medications are fine individually," he replied. I clenched the report tightly. suppressing the hatred bubbling inside me. As I stepped out of the private investigator's office, a familiar figure appeared at the entrance. He smiled warmly and linked his arm through mine, his gaze lingering for a brief second on the investigator's sign before asking casually, "Mom, what are you doing here?" My heart clenched. Brian must have grown suspicious after my unexpected visit to the company. I kept my expression neutral, my voice tinged with annoyance. "Are you following me?" Emma laughed, playfully tugging my arm. "No, of course not. Dad just asked me to check on you. He was worried about your health and didn't want you wandering around alone." Then she added sweetly, "By the way, Mother, what are you looking into?" I patted the back of her hand gently as we walked. "Let's go. I'll tell you on the way." Once inside the car, I let Emma drive. I entered a destination into the GPS and remained silent throughout the ride. We arrived at a small cafe, and I ordered coffee while leading her to a table by the large glass window on the second floor. Emma was clearly uneasy. Her guilt must have been eating away at her, making her nervous about what I might reveal. Finally, she couldn't hold back any longer. "Mother, what exactly are you suspecting? Why would you go to a private investigator? And what are we doing here?" I let her stew in her anxiety for a while before slowly opening the folder. With a pained expression, I sighed. I don't even know how to say this." My voice trembled, and I forced out a few tears. "It's just too painful to talk about." Emma, ever the concerned daughter-in-law, reached out to comfort me. "Mom, what happened? Tell me, maybe I can help." Wiping away my non-existent tears, I let my voice waver with sorrow. "I think your father-in-law is having an affair." Emma stiffened. Her expression shifted multiple times as if struggling to process what I had just said. "No, that can't be," she finally muttered. I sighed, feigning heartbreak. "I don't want to believe it either, but look at these." I pulled out the photos the private investigator had taken. They showed Brian being intimately close with a young woman. It was clear as day that the woman wasn't Emma. Emma stared at the photos, gripping them tightly, her lips slightly parted, unable to form a response. After a long silence, I asked, "Emma, do you know this woman?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "No," she said through gritted teeth. Trying to maintain her composure, she attempted to console me. "These pictures don't prove anything. Dad is a vice president at the company. It's normal for young women to approach him. Besides, he loves you deeply. He would never cheat on you." I sighed again. "I don't want to believe it either. That's why I wanted to see it with my own eyes." It finally dawned on her. I had brought her here to catch Brian in the act. Her fingers danced nervously over her phone screen. I wasn't worried about her warning Brian. If he was really involved with that woman, the one who had the most to lose wasn't me. It was her. Right on cue, a sleek luxury car pulled up across the street. A refined-looking middle-aged man stepped out, and a beautiful young woman clung to his arm. She leaned in and placed a soft kiss on his cheek. The man bent down slightly, seemingly returning the kiss. They had their backs turned to us, but Emma recognized him instantly. It was Brian. Her face turned as white as a sheet. I watched her from the corner of my eye, noting the way she clenched her fists, how she looked ready to storm out and confront Brian. The couple lingered in their embrace for a few moments before the young woman finally left. Only then did Brian get back into his car and drive home, as if nothing had happened. Emma sat frozen, her coffee untouched. She finally turned to me, her voice tight with urgency. "Mom, aren't you going to do something?" She was desperate. She wanted me to be the one to confront Brian. This girl was someone I had arranged. Why should I be in a hurry? She was one of the women Brian had once assaulted, forcing her to quit her job and disappear. It had taken me a long time to track her down, and I had invited her to help put on a little show. I let out a long sigh, as if finally resigning myself to fate. At my age, what can I even do? How can I compete with young women? I sounded utterly defeated. I continued, pretending to be bitter. And to think he even wrote a secret will behind my back. I wonder, who did he intend to leave his shares to? If it were Ethan, then why would he need to rewrite it? I had made my own will long ago, dividing my shares into two parts, half for Ethan, half for Brian. But Brian's portion? I had no idea who he'd planned to give it to. I forced myself to remain composed. The devoted husband who had seemingly loved me for years had been unfaithful all along. Who knew what else he had been hiding from me? A man's heart was like the depths of the ocean, impossible to fathom. Emma seemed lost in thought. Of course, she had to be. Brian was capable of murdering his own son. What kind of man wouldn't be ruthless enough to betray his wife? I gently placed my hand over hers and sighed. Emma, as women, we have to think about ourselves first. I took her to a law firm, where, under her witness, I revised my will. Brian's half of the company shares would now go to the baby, with Emma managing them until he came of age. This will be your security, I told her. Ethan might treat you well, or he might not, but your child, do you think he'd ever abandon his own mother? It didn't even matter whether the baby was Ethan's or Brian's. What mattered was that Emma had given birth to him. But Brian's money? That was a different story. Who knew how many illegitimate children he had out there? As long as the truth about the child's parentage remained buried, no one would ever question it. Emma's eyes lit up. I continued. I also went to the company today. I spoke with the general manager and asked him to promote you. I took her hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. We women need to be independent. You should focus on building a good life with Ethan. Have another child, and when that happens, I can revise the will again. I made her promise not to tell anyone about this. I'm too old to keep fighting. Just help me maintain the peace in this family until I'm gone. Emma nodded, but there was no way Brian wouldn't find out. Sure enough, over dinner, he brought it up. I heard you changed your will. I smiled calmly. Yes, I went to the law firm earlier today. Since you already know, let's make it official. I gestured for the housekeeper to bring out the previous version of the will. My shares have always been divided evenly between Ethan and you. These were the shares my father left me. Back in the 70s and 80s, my father was the director of a state-owned factory. When the company was privatized, he invested everything he had and even took out loans to acquire 30% of the business. The other shareholders appointed him to remain as director. Over the years, his shares were diluted, but he still retained 20%. That was a fortune in itself. When he passed, those shares went to me. I split them into two, half for Ethan, half for my grandson. Since the baby is still young, Emma will manage them until he comes of age. Emma already knew about this. Ethan had no objections either. The only one displeased was Brian. Why didn't you discuss this with me first? He asked. I reached out and patted his hand, smiling. You're upset that I'm leaving everything to our son and grandson? Brian stiffened. Of course not. Then there's nothing to worry about, I said cheerfully. Ethan has always been a filial son. Are you afraid he won't take care of you? Brian quickly composed himself. I just think a decision this big should have been discussed with me. Do you really think I would object? Then it's settled, I said, smiling as I picked up my chopsticks. Let's eat. At 1 a.m., I heard faint rustling beside me. Brian was getting out of bed. He quietly opened the door and slipped out. I opened my eyes, took out my phone, and connected my Bluetooth headset. The same day I visited the testing center and the company, I had also secretly purchased surveillance equipment. I had hidden cameras and listening devices in various corners of the house, including Brian's study. This was the one place in the entire house that Brian never let anyone near. And sure enough, there they were, Brian and Emma, whispering to each other in the study. Brian was visibly uneasy about my recent actions, especially regarding the changes to my will. Why change the will at this time? He asked, his voice edged with suspicion. The more guilty someone is, the more they stir up trouble. Emma seemed lost in her own thoughts and didn't immediately respond. Brian grabbed her chin, forcing her to look at him, and inhaled deeply near her neck. You're not actually letting that ugly hag get into your head, are you? His voice turned cold. If Ethan finds out the baby isn't his, do you really think you'll get a dime of that inheritance? Emma smiled faintly. And are you really going to leave everything to the baby? Brian answered without hesitation. Of course. He's my son. Everything I have belongs to him. Emma hesitated for a moment before asking, Do you have any other women? She was testing him. Brian tightened his embrace around her and murmured sweet nothings. You're the only one. There's no one else. You and the baby are my whole world. Emma fell silent. Brian's voice turned sharp. We need to move forward with our plan. Things are getting risky. He was afraid I would uncover the truth. He wanted to strike first. Emma's eyes flickered with hesitation. "You're not backing out, are you?" Brian's tone turned dangerous. Sensing her wavering resolve, he added coldly, "You better remember, Emma, me, you and the baby are the only real family here. We're the only ones connected by blood." Emma forced a smile. "Of course, I remember." Brian hardened his resolve. "Good, then stick to the plan. Make sure you set everything up with the mechanic tomorrow." I removed my earpiece, feeling a deep chill settle in my heart. Brian was truly going through with it. He was really going to kill Ethan. Ethan wasn't biologically related to either of us. He had been adopted. I had always been frail since childhood, my heart weak and unable to withstand stress. Even after marrying Brian, I struggled to conceive for years. When I finally got pregnant, my heart condition worsened, and I lost the baby. Brian had comforted me back then, telling me we didn't need a child, that having me was enough. But I had felt guilty, so I convinced him to adopt. Ethan came to us when he was just over a year old. We had raised him together for over 20 years. And yet Brian could discard him without hesitation, plotting his murder with the same hands that had once lifted him up as a child. In my past life, after Ethan's death, Brian and Emma had openly discussed how they had orchestrated his accident right in front of me with no fear or shame. They had bribed a mechanic at an auto repair shop to tamper with the brakes. Then, they had arranged for Ethan to take that very car on a business trip. Midway through his journey, the brakes failed. The car crashed through a guardrail and plummeted off a cliff. The vehicle caught fire, leaving nothing but charred remains. While I was drowning in grief, those two had popped open a bottle of champagne and celebrated in my presence. I had been locked inside that house, screaming for help, but no one had come. I clenched my fists so tightly that my nails dug into my palms. Just then, the door handle turned. I quickly shut my eyes, pretending to be asleep. No matter what, I wouldn't let Ethan meet the same fate again. The next morning, just as I had expected, Emma urged Ethan to take his car in for maintenance. "You've been putting it off for so long," she nagged. "I told you to do it ages ago, and you still haven't gone. You're leaving for your trip tomorrow. I already booked an appointment. Just take it in today, okay?" Ethan, being his usual self, casually agreed. But Brian and Emma never got the news they were expecting. Instead of Ethan getting into an accident, it was Emma. She had gone out for a drive and ended up in a crash. She was rushed to the hospital. Now, she lay in a hospital bed. Her right leg was wrapped in thick bandages, stiff as a pillar. Her face was disfigured and she had suffered a concussion. Even after undergoing surgery, she had yet to regain consciousness. On the surface, I wore an expression of distress, feigning concern for her well-being. But inside, I felt nothing but satisfaction. Emma was nothing short of a venomous snake, beautiful on the outside, but utterly rotten on the inside. In my past life, it was she who had suggested killing Ethan. She was the one who had locked me in the basement, used me as an outlet for her anger, tortured me whenever she felt displeased. She took my phone, usurped my place in the household, and whispered into Brian's ear every night, urging him to get rid of me once and for all. She kept reminding him that as long as I was alive, they could never be truly free. Brian had been too cautious. He didn't want the police investigating anything suspicious, so he insisted on waiting for my health to deteriorate on its own. But Emma had no patience. She took her frustrations out on me, feeding me scraps fit for a pig, beating me whenever she pleased. She burned all of Ethan's belongings in front of me, cursing him to rot in hell. She taunted me, sneering that if I had just died sooner, I wouldn't have had to suffer so much. She deserved everything that had happened to her. If she hadn't tried to kill Ethan, this wouldn't have come back to bite her. Ethan rushed to the hospital, out of breath. Brian, standing by, looked visibly unsettled. He couldn't understand why it was Emma who had ended up in the accident. "You didn't take your own car?" he asked, his expression darkening. Ethan frowned. "Of course, I did." I let out a quiet chuckle. "Brian, what exactly do you mean by that? Are you suggesting you knew something was going to happen to his car?" Brian was quick to recover, shaking his head. "What? No. I only asked because I thought his car was in for maintenance. Emma and Ethan drove identical cars. I had chosen them that way on purpose, a matching set for husband and wife. Except for their license plates, they were indistinguishable. The mechanics had only been told that Ethan would be dropping off a car for servicing. They had no idea which car he would actually bring in. Thankfully, in my past life, Brian and Emma had boasted in front of me about their plan. Brian had been careful not to leave a trail, so he made Emma take the lead. But she wasn't nearly as cautious as he was. That was how I had found a gap in their plan to exploit. Ethan, still in shock, lowered his head and avoided Brian's gaze. Brian, noticing his odd behavior, furrowed his brows. "What's wrong with you today?" I stepped forward before Ethan could respond. "His wife is lying in a hospital bed. How do you think he feels?" I patted Ethan's back gently. "The surgery went well. She might wake up soon." As I spoke, the police arrived. Since it was a traffic accident, an official investigation had to be conducted. Brian was too preoccupied with handling the police to keep paying attention to Ethan. His priority now was ensuring that neither he nor Emma was implicated in any wrongdoing. In Emma's VIP hospital room, I had arranged for a private nurse to look after her. Brian didn't stay long. He had too many loose ends to tie up. Ethan, meanwhile, sat outside the hospital on a bench, smoking. When he saw me approach, his voice was laced with pain. "Mom, I don't care about Emma, but why? Why would Dad?" I didn't know how to comfort him. Before Ethan had taken his car in for maintenance, I had stopped him and given him the results of the paternity test. His first reaction wasn't to ask why the baby belonged to Brian. Instead, his voice shook as he asked, "Why? Why don't I have any biological relation to the baby at all?" Even if the child was Brian and Emma's, Ethan and the baby should have shared at least a sibling connection. Yet, the DNA test showed nothing, no relation whatsoever. The secret I had kept hidden for 25 years had finally come to light. That was the first devastating blow he suffered. I had then told him to take Emma's car to the shop instead. He had asked why, and all I said was, "You'll understand when you come back from your trip." He had left with confusion in his heart. Now he had returned to an even harsher reality. I had no answer for him, because I too could not understand why Brian hated me so much. Ethan had been dragged into this simply because he was my son. I could still remember the venom in Brian's voice before I died in my past life. "If it weren't for your father, do you really think you'd be worthy of me? Look at yourself. You're ugly and barren. You should have never been my wife. Your father said that if my health was poor, we simply wouldn't have children. So why was it you?" His words echoed in my mind, full of resentment. "You ruined things between me and Shanshan." Shanshan, Brian's first love. She was nothing like me. She was beautiful, bright, and elegant. She had been his college classmate. When Brian first joined my father's company, I had taken a liking to him immediately. He was fair-skinned, handsome, and talented. My father, upon learning of my interest, arranged for us to be together. Brian, fearing that dating Shanshan would impact his career and future, ultimately chose to marry me instead. For 30 years, he played the role of the perfect son-in-law in front of my father, acting as a devoted husband who cared for me in every possible way. If he hadn't tortured me in my final days, cursing both me and my father, I would never have known that he had always been in love with another woman. That he had spent decades resenting me. I gently comforted Ethan, assuring him, "This will all be over soon. Just remember, Mom will always love you." When I returned home from the hospital, Brian was waiting. "How's Emma?" he asked. "She's still unconscious," I replied. "The doctor said that as long as she wakes up, there shouldn't be any major issues." Relief flickered across Brian's face, though he quickly masked it with a look of concern. This accident had happened on a city road. Emma's car had flipped after hitting a median, but it hadn't been completely wrecked. That meant the police could easily inspect it and trace the brake failure back to tampering. And once they looked into it, they would find that it was Emma herself who had contacted the mechanic and instructed him on how to sabotage the brakes. With her incapacitated, the trail wouldn't lead back to Brian. As for why Emma would tamper with her own car, well, that was anyone's guess. I let out a long sigh. "Do you think someone was trying to harm her?" Brian immediately tensed. Who would want to hurt her? Ethan had told him he had mistaken the cars, but Brian didn't believe him. He had already started to grow suspicious of me. I took my time before answering. A lover's quarrel, maybe? I mused. I've been wondering if she's been cheating on our son. Brian's reaction was instant. That's impossible. I arched a brow. Oh, and how do you know that? Because I trust Emma's character. I didn't press the issue. Instead, I shifted the topic slightly. Didn't I tell you before that the baby doesn't resemble Ethan? Brian froze for a split second, but I caught it. I had lived with him for over 30 years. I knew every nuance of his expressions. But he recovered quickly. That's not unusual, he said smoothly. Sometimes kids only take after one parent. I let out a thoughtful hum. I was afraid of making false accusations, so I had a little investigation done. And well, I did find something interesting. Brian straightened slightly, his attention fully on me now. You had a first love in college, didn't you? I said slowly. I heard you broke up when you joined the company. His jaw tightened. I continued, pretending to be oblivious to his reaction. Do you think it was because we wanted Ethan to marry Emma? That maybe we unknowingly tore apart another pair of lovers? Brian's face darkened. Emma had joined the company right after graduation. She had been assigned to Brian's department, where he had quickly taken an interest in her. That affair had started long before Ethan had fallen for her. When she became pregnant, Ethan had been the one to take responsibility, and I had been the one to push for their marriage. Looking back, I regretted it deeply. But now, at least, I had a chance to make things right. Emma, however, hadn't remained faithful either. She was still sneaking around with another man, her own first love. Of course, I had orchestrated that little reunion myself. I had arranged for them to run into each other by accident, hoping to snap a few incriminating photos. But I had gotten far more than I expected. The two of them had clearly never gotten over each other. They talked for hours, completely engrossed in each other's company, reluctant to part ways. And then, they had checked into a hotel together. It was practically gift-wrapped evidence. I knew Brian had never truly let go of his first love either. She had been a thorn in his heart for years, a name he never spoke but could never forget. And now, he had to deal with the fact that Emma had done the same to him. His hands clenched into fists, his knuckles turning white as he stared at the photos. He was practically burning a hole through them with his glare. Originally, I had planned to arrange another paternity test, but then the accident happened. Feigning curiosity, I asked, "Do you think there's a connection between these two things?" Brian slowly unclenched his fists, his expression once again smooth and unreadable. He smiled faintly. "You think her first love did this to her?" "Why would he?" I pondered for a moment. There really was no clear motive. But hadn't the police already confirmed that she had instructed someone to tamper with the brakes? Could it be that she was afraid of being exposed and attempted suicide? Brian immediately dismissed my speculation. If that were the case, she could have just walked away with nothing. Why would she throw away her life? Then he turned to me with concern, attempting to reassure me. "Maybe you've been overthinking things lately. You've been exhausted. Don't stress yourself too much." I played along, nodding. "Maybe you're right. Now that she's in this condition, insisting on a paternity test would just make me look heartless. Forget it. It's pitiful, really. Maybe I was just overthinking." Brian helped me upstairs as usual, pouring me a glass of water and handing me my medication with that ever-so-gentle expression. But I knew his suspicions were consuming him. He would definitely get the paternity test done himself. Before the results could come out, Emma woke up. She lost control in the hospital room, smashing a mirror and chasing away the nurse. My face, she screamed in hysterics. The car had flipped and caught fire, causing partial burns on her body. Shards of glass had also cut into her face. I had already installed a surveillance camera in the hospital room, linking it directly to my phone. Through the footage, I watched as Emma completely broke down. She thrashed wildly, forcing the doctors and nurses to sedate her. By the time she woke up again, she was met with 2 police officers. The investigation had confirmed that she had arranged for the brake tampering herself. When asked why she had done it, Emma clutched her head, pretending to be disoriented. "The first instruction you gave was just to slightly weaken the brakes." "Why did you later order them to be fully disabled?" one officer asked. Emma's expression froze in confusion. "What second time? I never gave a second order." No wonder the crash was so severe. The two officers exchanged glances. So you admit to ordering the brake tampering in the first place? Emma's face twisted in panic as she tried to feign ignorance. What are you talking about? I don't know anything. I'm the victim here. You should be investigating who tried to kill me. Look at me, I'm the one who's hurt. Go find out who did this. Ethan held her down, apologizing to the officers. She's emotionally unstable. Maybe it would be best to come back another time. But the evidence was irrefutable. Emma was desperately trying to evade responsibility. We already have the proof. Denying it won't help you. One officer stated flatly. The other officer added, what you need to do now is identify the person who issued the second command. Saying this, he played a recorded phone call. The mechanic, fearing investigation, had taken precautions. He had kept evidence. The voice had been altered, but Emma recognized it immediately. It was Brian. Her entire body stiffened as if she had been struck by lightning. She stopped struggling. This plan had been concocted by both of them. If it wasn't her, then the only other person it could be was Brian. She had been so sure of herself, convinced that Brian needed her. But now, faced with the truth, she realized that he had called the mechanic himself. I had planted a seed in her mind earlier, and now it had taken root. Compared to staying with Brian, wouldn't it be better to align herself with Ethan instead? If she had another child with him, she could solidify her hold over the company shares. The baby's inheritance was in her hands. Why should she continue taking risks for Brian? It wouldn't take long for her to reach a conclusion. Brian had always been cautious. Even towards Ethan, the son he had raised, he had shown no mercy. If he could betray Ethan so ruthlessly, would he truly protect her in the long run? And then, there was that young, beautiful woman who had been so close to Brian. There was no way Emma wouldn't start feeling threatened. Brian was the one who had ruined her. And now, Brian's fate would be no better. I had been quietly gathering every piece of evidence of his corruption, bribery, embezzlement, sexual harassment, even rape cases involving female employees. I had sent everything to the senior executives of the company. An internal investigation was already underway. Brian was overwhelmed, scrambling to handle the fallout. But his biggest concern wasn't the company, it was the paternity test. In my past life, his greatest resentment toward me had been my inability to conceive. This time, I knew he would go to the testing center himself to retrieve the report. So I went ahead of him. As his wife, I had every right to access the results. Seizing the opportunity, I swapped the real report with a fake one. As soon as Brian got the paternity test results, he flipped through the pages. The fury in his eyes could have burned down the entire building. Without a word, he stormed toward the hospital. I had already called ahead, instructing the nurse and Ethan to leave. Then, I sat back in my car, comfortably waiting for this show of mutual destruction to unfold. The moment Brian entered the hospital room, he threw the test results in Emma's face. Just as he was about to lash out, Emma lunged at him, slapping and scratching wildly. "This is all your fault. You ruined me," she screamed. Brian shoved her off, not caring about anything but one question. "Whose child is this?" His voice was dangerously low. "You filthy whore, you cheated on me." The well-mannered, polished man he had pretended to be all these years was gone. His face twisted with rage, his entire being consumed with the urge to strangle the woman before him. "What the hell are you talking about?" Emma shrieked. Brian shoved the report in her face. "Look at it. The baby isn't mine." Emma froze, then suddenly burst into laughter. "It has to be Ethan's. It has to be his." Her eyes gleamed with hope. If the child was Ethan's, she could still secure her fortune. She could still live the life of a rich woman. Keep dreaming. Brian pulled out another set of test results, completely shattering her delusion. I had 2 tests done. Emma's entire body stiffened. "You've been seeing that bastard behind my back, haven't you?" Brian roared. "You were cheating on me the whole damn time." Emma snapped. "I never did anything with him. You just want to get rid of me. You faked these results, didn't you? The baby could only belong to Ethan or you. There's no third possibility," she shrieked, finally connecting the dots. "The car accident." She was more certain than ever. "Good. You plan to replace me with your little mistresses, but now you want to pin this on me?" Her voice was venomous. Brian had no idea what this crazy woman was talking about. All he knew was that the child wasn't his. That meant she had lied to him. Emma lost all control. I've lost everything. Do you think I don't know about your women? I had nothing to begin with, and now you've ruined me completely. She suddenly laughed maniacally, then spat. You raped me. You threatened me. If not for that, do you think I'd ever be with you? Brian's expression turned deadly. You're ruthless. You tried to kill your own son and wife, she screamed. I'll tell the police everything. I'll make sure they lock you up for good. Brian lunged at her, his hands closing around her throat. Emma saw the murderous intent in his eyes and rolled off the bed, trying to escape. But her legs were injured. She couldn't move fast enough. Within seconds, Brian grabbed her again. I'll kill you, you bitch, he snarled. Emma struggled fiercely. You have all these women, but none of them ever gave you a son, she gasped. Because the problem isn't with me. It's you. You're the one who can't have children. The words struck Brian like a knife to the chest. I knew Emma was digging her own grave. Sure enough, through the surveillance footage, I saw her slowly stop moving. Brian suddenly snapped back to reality. Panic flooded his face as he stumbled back a few steps. His hands trembled as he reached out, hesitantly checking if Emma was still breathing. A nurse outside the room screamed, "Murder! Someone's been killed." Brian bolted. I watched coldly as the final act of this play came to an end. A murder case immediately triggered a full police investigation, and Brian became a wanted fugitive. Women who had suffered under him, victims of his harassment, abuse, and exploitation, finally stepped forward. His past misdeeds at work, the bribes, the corruption, all of it was exposed. The company wasted no time stripping him of his position. He became a disgraced man, hunted and despised by all. A once perfect family shattered in an instant. The company's senior management invited me back to help clean up the mess. As I walked through the office, I felt the weight of their stares. Some pitied me, others gossiped behind my back. So Brian was that kind of man all along? And Emma, his mistress, he forced her to marry his own son and have his child? Ethan and his mother must feel humiliated beyond words. Ethan was furious, his pride wounded. I patted his shoulder and told him firmly, "We didn't do anything wrong, so why should we lower our heads? Hold your head high." Ethan was still downcast, needing time to heal. Aside from handling company affairs, I also began processing the legal adoption of the baby. I didn't like him, and I certainly had no intention of keeping him. The greatest kindness I could offer was to find him a good family to take him in. I no longer spent my days locked inside the house. Instead, I focused on exercising, rebuilding my social life, and, for the first time in years, I realized how wonderful the world outside still was. One evening, after finishing my jog, I was on my way home when I sensed someone following me. I deliberately slowed down, waiting for them to catch up. Just as I was nearing my house, the person behind me blocked my path. It was Brian. "Sue, for the sake of our years together as husband and wife, please, help me." I never expected him to still have the audacity to come to me for help. "And how exactly do you want me to help you?" I asked, my voice calm. "You have connections. Get me out of the country. Thailand, Canada, Australia, anywhere." I stared at him. Brian was no longer the successful and dignified man he once was. He looked like a vagrant, unkempt, desperate. "What makes you think I would help you?" "Sue, I love you," he pleaded. "It was Emma who seduced me. I made a terrible mistake, but haven't we always been in love? I was just momentarily foolish." How utterly laughable. He really thought I would still fall for his lies, just as I had in my youth, believing every word he said, loving him without conditions. "Where was that so-called love when you were trying to get rid of me?" I said coldly. "Bookmark, go back." Brian froze, momentarily at a loss for words. Then, as if something snapped in his mind, his expression twisted in fury. "I knew it. You were behind all of this. You did this to me." A glint of silver flashed in the dim light. He pulled out a knife and lunged at me. I staggered back, calculating how much longer it would take for the police to arrive. The blade was just inches away when suddenly Ethan appeared out of nowhere, grabbing the knife and shoving Brian to the ground. "Dad, how did you become like this?" he roared. "Why are you doing this to Mom? To me?" The emotions he had been suppressing for so long finally exploded. Brian, still seething, pointed at me. "Why are you asking me?" "Ask her." His voice was raw with resentment. Sue, you ruined everything. You tore me away from Shanshan. You used your father's power to force me into marriage. And you? His eyes burned with years of hatred. You never even respected me. You treated me like a servant in your house. You made me sign that damn prenup. If I ever cheated, I'd walk away with nothing, not a single cent. I slaved away in your father's company for decades and never saw a dime. His voice grew more hysterical. My parents were humiliated under your family? I was their only son, and yet you couldn't even give me a child. You made sure the Yang family had no heir. You think I shouldn't hate you for that? Shameless, completely delusional. Without my father, would you have achieved anything? I sneered. If we hadn't signed that prenup, do you really think my father and I would have lived to see today? If you hated it so much, you could have divorced me. Why stay? The truth was simple. He had always been greedy. He had chased status and power, but when things fell apart, he pushed all the blame onto me, refusing to take responsibility for his own failures. There was no point in arguing with a man like this. As the scene in front of me faded into the past, my life took a new turn. After finalizing the adoption, Ethan decided to leave the country for further studies and to clear his mind. I agreed. The massive villa once filled with so many people now felt unbearably empty. So, I sold it. Instead, I rented a small farmhouse in the countryside. I spent my days tending to a garden, growing vegetables, and caring for flowers. I made new friends, joined in community dances, and for the first time in a long while, I felt free. During a routine health checkup, the doctor was surprised. My body had improved significantly. As the music in the square faded into the evening air, I knew I had finally reclaimed my life. I wiped the sweat from my forehead and listened as the women around me chatted about the Mother's Day gifts their sons had sent them. Sue, what about your son? Didn't Ethan send you anything? I had been living here for a year now, and they had never met Ethan since he was still abroad. He sent his gift long ago, I replied with a smile. Over the past year, Ethan and I had kept in touch through video calls. When he had first left, he had been in low spirits, still struggling with everything that had happened. But as time passed, I could see the change in him. Slowly but surely, he was moving on. As I made my way home, the soft glow of a street lamp illuminated the path ahead. Beneath the dim light under the eaves of my house, a familiar figure stood waiting. Warmth filled my heart. Ethan rushed forward to greet me. I reached out and gently touched his sun-kissed face, feeling the roughness of his skin from exposure to the sun. Let's go home, I said, and together we walked inside.